France, August 1944. A detention area, 40 meters of trampled grass between the wire and the transport trucks. Captain Werner Schmidt sits on the ground, hands behind his back, watching. He has been a soldier his entire adult life. Poland in 39, France in 40, the Eastern Front in 41. He knows what discipline looks like. He knows what victory requires. 300 years of Prussian military culture runs through his veins like iron. And now he watches something he cannot process. 40 meters away, an American staff sergeant stands at a vehicle hood. A map is pinned to the metal. Next to him, Private Tommy Blake, 22 years old, truck driver from Indiana. Not standing at attention. Not silent. Blake is pointing at the map. Blake is arguing. Not whispering. Not glancing nervously at his officer. Blake is raising his voice. He jabs his finger at the paper. He shakes his head. And the sergeant, the Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen, 30 years old, 5'10", brown hair going gray at the temples, the sergeant is listening. Actually listening. Then the sergeant changes the plan. He adjusts the route. He turns to an officer standing behind him. A lieutenant. The lieutenant nods. Confirms the change. Schmidt leans over to the German soldier beside him. "They are not soldiers," he says quietly in German. "They are a mob." He means it. In his world, in everything he has been taught since he was 18 years old. This scene is chaos. A private arguing with a sergeant. A sergeant adjusting a plan based on a private's objection. This is a breakdown of everything the military system exists to prevent. He is wrong. But he will not understand why until it is too late. Because what Captain Werner Schmidt is watching is not a failure of discipline. It is the secret weapon. It is the thing that will end his war. And it has nothing to do with tanks or artillery or the number of divisions on the line. Knoxville, Tennessee. 3 years earlier. Robert Jensen stands behind a counter, a bottle of bourbon in his hand. The customer, a man in his 50s, shakes his head. "That's too much," the customer says. "It's the going rate," Jensen replies. "Your competitor down the street sells it for 20 cents less." Jensen sets the bottle down. He does not get defensive. He does not dismiss the complaint. He thinks. "Then why are you here?" he asks. The customer pauses. "Because you know your whiskey. Because when I bought that rye last month, you told me it would pair well with the cigars I smoke. And you were right." Jensen nods. "So you're paying for the knowledge, not just the bottle." "I suppose I am." "Then the price is fair." The customer considers this. Then he pulls out his wallet. This is who Robert Jensen is in 1941. A man who argues. A man who questions. A man who grew up in a democracy where your voice matters, where you do not simply accept what you are told, where the person behind the counter and the person in front of it meet as equals. He is 5'10", 165 pounds, brown hair, hazel eyes, hands calloused from lifting crates. He has a Tennessee drawl that softens his consonants and stretches his vowels. He has spent his adult life selling whiskey, arguing with customers about prices, questioning distributors about routes, pushing back when something does not make sense. On December 8, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor, he walks into a recruiting office. He is 27 years old. He has never fired a rifle in combat. He has never followed an order he did not understand. He has never stopped asking why. The United States Army is about to teach him to do all three things at once. And the collision between those two worlds, between the democratic habits of a whiskey salesman from Tennessee and the rigid structure of military hierarchy, will forge something no Prussian war college ever anticipated. But first, we need to understand what that Prussian system actually was. Because there is a version of this story where absolute discipline is the weapon. And there is a version where it is the cage. Prussia, 1757. King Frederick the Great stands on a battlefield after the Battle of Rossbach. He has just destroyed a French and Austrian force twice the size of his own army. 90 minutes. Complete victory. He should be celebrating. He is furious. Not at the enemy. At his own subordinates. His regimental commanders, some of the finest soldiers in Europe, had refused to take independent action during the engagement. Twice, moments where a commander with nerve could have broken the enemy completely. His officers had stopped, looked over their shoulders, and waited for orders from above. Frederick writes about it afterward. His men, he complains, will not act without being told specifically what to do. His experienced colonels treat orders as sacred commands to be followed to the letter, rather than as goals to be achieved through any available means. He sees what it costs him. He sees battles that could have been decisive, crushing victories settled for ordinary wins because the men in the middle of the chain refused to think. Frederick the Great himself sees the cage being built. He sees it clearly. And then 3 generations of Prussian military culture lock the cage shut and throw away the key. For nearly 300 years, the Prussian and later German military system builds itself on a single philosophical principle. The soldier obeys, not because he agrees, not because he understands. He obeys because the system demands it, because the hierarchy is sacred, because any deviation from orders, even tactically brilliant deviation, is a crime against military order. This is not arbitrary cruelty. There is a logic to it. In the age of muskets and line infantry, absolute obedience produces predictable results in battle. Formations that move on command, turn on command, fire on command. A soldier who thinks for himself in that context is not an asset. He is a gap in the line. So Prussia trains the thinking out of them, not the tactical thinking of officers. That is cultivated in the officer class with extraordinary care. But the thinking of the common soldier, that is a liability. The soldier's job is to load, aim, fire, advance, and die on schedule. His job is not to wonder why. They build institutions to reinforce it. 16 weeks of basic training in the Wehrmacht during the years before the war includes 30 parade drills per week. Not combat drills. Not tactical exercises. Parade drills. The repetitive, mechanical conditioning of men to move their bodies on command. The ritual of obedience performed daily until it becomes reflex. Officers spend almost 4 years in training. 2 years in the troops. Rotations at infantry school, weapons school. The knowledge is extraordinary. The culture is unforgiving. And here is the part that complicates the comfortable narrative. This system works. It works brilliantly. The Wehrmacht of 1939 to 1941 is perhaps the finest battlefield instrument in human history at the tactical level. The level of the company, the battalion, the regiment. The men execute with speed and precision their enemies cannot match. Poland. For weeks to total victory. France. 6 weeks to the complete destruction of an army that had spent 20 years building the Maginot Line, the British Expeditionary Force, the entire French General Staff's plan for defending civilization. All of it swept away in 42 days by men who obey their orders with mechanical precision and officers trained to think 2 levels above their rank. German military intelligence after the fall of France refers to the American military as Britain's Italians. They mean a nation with numbers, factories, enthusiasm, and a complete inability to translate any of those things into soldiers. The joke makes the rounds in the officer corps. America will provide the quantity of incompetence that Italy is providing to the Axis cause. In 1940, the United States Army is the 17th largest in the world. 174,000 soldiers. Roughly the same size as Portugal's military. The Wehrmacht numbers in the millions. But there is one more piece to this picture. One piece that Captain Schmidt, watching American soldiers argue in that French field, does not yet understand. Because Prussian obedience has a ceiling. It is built into the design from the beginning, and it has nothing to do with the Americans. It has to do with what happens when the man at the top of the chain of command is wrong. In a system where soldiers do not argue, where every order flows down and every man executes without question, the entire machine runs on the quality of the decisions being made at the top. The obedient soldier is only as good as the commander he obeys. And in August 1934, every soldier in the Wehrmacht swears a personal oath. Not to Germany, not to the Constitution, to a man. The oath reads, "I swear by God this sacred oath to the leader of the German Empire and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. I shall render unconditional obedience. 300 years of Prussian military culture. 16 weeks of drilling obedience into men's bones. An oath to a single individual, concentrated into a system that moves like a perfect machine. But what no one asks is what happens when the machine gets bad orders. North Africa, January 1943. Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen steps off a transport ship in Algiers. He has been in the army for 14 months. He has been promoted twice. He wears 3 stripes on his sleeve and carries a Thompson submachine gun. His face is tanned from training in the California desert. His Tennessee drawl has not faded. He is assigned to the 2nd Corps, a staff sergeant in a line company. His job is to lead men, execute orders, and keep his soldiers alive. Within 3 weeks, he is staring at a map that makes no sense. The approach roads are channeled. Narrow valleys with high ridges on both sides. Perfect kill zones for anyone with artillery and high ground. The defensive positions are exposed. Flat terrain with no cover. The timing is wrong. The plan calls for a daylight advance through terrain that favors the defender in every possible way. Jensen looks at the map. He looks at the lieutenant briefing the platoon. He opens his mouth. Then he closes it. Because he has been in the army for 14 months, and in those 14 months he has learned one thing above all others. You do not question the plan. You do not argue with officers. You execute. That is the job. The democratic habits of a whiskey salesman from Tennessee, the man who argued with customers, who questioned distributors, who pushed back when something did not make sense, those habits are still there. But they are buried now under 14 months of training that has taught him the opposite lesson. Obey. Execute. Do not think. He stays silent. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a small voice says this is wrong. The approach is wrong. The positions are wrong. The timing is wrong. Men are going to die. But the system, the military hierarchy he has been taught to respect, the chain of command that flows from above, tells him that his job is not to question. His job is to follow. So he does. 28 days pass. Jensen spends them watching.
Observing terrain.
Questioning orders in his head but never out loud. The democratic habits still there, buried under 14 months of training that said obey, execute, don't think. On the 28th day, the price of that silence comes due. February 14th, 1943. 4:30 in the morning. The sky over Tunisia is still dark when the first shells hit. Jensen is asleep in a foxhole when the ground beneath him erupts. Not a single explosion. A rolling barrage. Artillery fire walking across the American positions like the footsteps of a giant. He is awake before his eyes open. Men are screaming. The earth is shaking. Somewhere to his left, a truck explodes, and the fireball turns night into day for 3 seconds. Then darkness again. Then another explosion. Then another. Rommel's Afrika Korps is coming. Jensen grabs his Thompson and rolls out of the foxhole. The plan, the one he looked at 28 days ago, the one that made no sense, is collapsing in real time. The approach roads he knew were channeled are now filled with German armor. The defensive positions he knew were exposed are being overrun. The timing he knew was wrong has become catastrophic. American tanks are moving forward without infantry coordination. American infantry is attacking in parade ground formations, neat lines that make perfect targets for German machine guns. There is no combined arms integration. There is no reconnaissance. There is no flexibility. There is only chaos. Jensen's platoon is ordered to hold a position on a low ridge. They hold it for 6 hours. Then the Germans bring up artillery and pound the ridge until the rocks themselves turn to powder. When the barrage lifts, Panzer tanks roll through the gap where Jensen's platoon used to be. He pulls 8 men out. 8 out of 42. For 5 days, the 2nd Corps is driven back. 50 miles of retreat. 6,500 casualties. 183 tanks destroyed. 208 artillery pieces abandoned. Roughly 20% of the engaged force ceases to exist as a fighting unit. On the 3rd day, a piece of German shrapnel catches Jensen in the left shoulder. 2 inches deep. It misses the bone by half an inch. A medic pulls it out with forceps and stitches the wound shut with 4 crude stitches. No anesthetic. Jensen bites down on a strip of leather and does not make a sound. The pain is nothing compared to the other thing he feels. Guilt. On February 19, 1943, 5 days after the battle begins, Jensen sits in a field hospital tent and writes in a diary. The diary is small, leather-bound, something his sister sent him from Tennessee. His handwriting is tight, compressed, the letters crammed together as if he is trying to fit too many words into too small a space. He writes, "I knew the plan was wrong. I saw it. The approach roads, the positions, the timing, all of it. And I said nothing." He underlines the last 2 words 3 times. 42 men in his platoon. 8 walked out. 34 did not. And Robert Jensen, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, whiskey salesman from Knoxville, Tennessee, the man who spent his entire adult life arguing with customers and questioning distributors and pushing back when something did not make sense, had stayed silent when it mattered most. The democratic habits were still there, buried, waiting, but the cost of keeping them buried is now written in blood. March 6, 1943. General Marcus Sullivan arrives at 2nd Corps headquarters. He is 57 years old. Silver hair, sharp eyes, a reputation for being hard but fair. He has 17 days to transform a shattered corps before the Germans attack again. 17 days. Same men, same equipment, same enemy. The textbooks would say he needs months. The textbooks are wrong. Sullivan does something on his 2nd day that shocks every officer in the Corps. He leaves headquarters. He drives to the front. He walks the ground. And then he does something even more shocking. He talks to the sergeants. Not a formal inspection. Not a parade ground review. He walks up to a group of NCOs sitting outside a command tent, men with dirt on their uniforms and exhaustion in their eyes, and he asks them a question. "What happened at Kasserine?" The sergeants look at each other. No one speaks. You do not tell a general that the plan was garbage. You do not tell a general that men died because someone at headquarters did not understand the terrain. Sullivan waits. Finally, one of the sergeants speaks. His name is Frank O'Brien, 32 years old, 5 years in the regular army before the war. He has a Boston accent and a scar over his left eye from a bar fight in 1938. "The approach roads were kill zones, sir," O'Brien says. "Anyone with eyes could see it." Sullivan does not get angry. He does not dismiss the comment. He pulls out a map. "Show me," he says. O'Brien shows him, points to the valleys, the ridges, the positions, explains how the Germans had high ground and pre-registered artillery, how the American tanks moved without infantry support, how the defensive positions were exposed. Sullivan listens. Then he asks another question. "Did anyone report this before the battle?" Silence. Sullivan looks around the group. His eyes land on Jensen. Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen, 30 years old, left shoulder bandaged, Tennessee drawl, the man who saw it all and said nothing. "You," Sullivan says. "You were there. Did you see it?" Jensen hesitates. Every instinct from 14 months of training tells him to deflect, to say he followed orders, to protect the chain of command. But something else rises in him. Something older than his time in the army. Something from Knoxville, from arguments with customers, from a life spent questioning and pushing back and refusing to accept what did not make sense. "Yes, sir," Jensen says. "I saw it. And I stayed silent, sir." Sullivan looks at him for a long moment. Then he says something that changes everything. "Don't do that again. Not an order. Not a reprimand. Permission. Permission to argue. Permission to question. Permission to use the democratic habits that the army had been trying to drill out of him for 14 months. Sullivan turns to the rest of the sergeants. "You see a bad plan, you speak," he says. "That's your job now. I would rather have an NCO who argues with me and is right than an NCO who stays silent and watches men die. Is that clear?" "Yes, sir," they say. But Jensen hears something else in those words. He hears Frederick the Great complaining that his colonels would not act without orders. He hears 300 years of Prussian obedience breaking against the reality of modern war. He hears the beginning of something new, a system that listens. March 23, 1943. Elgetar, Tunice. The 10th Panzer Division, the same formation that helped rout American forces 6 weeks earlier, attacks with 50 of its 57 available tanks. They come down a valley toward what they expect to be the disorganized wreckage of an American corps. What they find instead is a kill zone. Tank destroyers in concealed positions on the valley walls. Positions that Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen identified during a reconnaissance patrol 3 days earlier. Positions that he argued for in a briefing with a captain who initially dismissed them. Positions that he convinced that captain to adopt by walking the terrain and showing him, step by step, why they would work. The German tanks roll into the valley. The American guns open from 3 directions simultaneously. Artillery, pre-registered on every approach route. Coordinates that Jensen helped calculate. Fire missions that he helped plan. Not because he is an artillery officer. Because he is a sergeant who was given permission to think. A minefield stalls 8 German tanks in the opening minutes. The minefield that Jensen suggested placing exactly there in that choke point because he had seen how the Germans maneuvered at Kasserine and knew they would try the same approach here. The following vehicles compress into a formation with no room to maneuver. When the American guns finish, the valley is a graveyard. 32 burning tanks. Smoke rising in black columns against the North African sky. 4 American tanks are lost. Rommel writes in his private papers, recovered after the war, that American commanders had absorbed the lessons of mobile warfare with remarkable speed. The same army he had scattered 6 weeks earlier was fighting back with systematic precision. But it is not systematic precision. It is something else entirely. It is Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen and men like him, sergeants who had been given permission to argue, to question, to use the knowledge they had gained through blood and failure and the painful lesson that silence kills. After the battle, Jensen sits on the hood of a jeep and looks at the valley. Smoke rising. Metal burning. He thinks about Kasserine. 42 men in his platoon. 8 walked out. He thinks about the map he saw 28 days before that battle. The plan that made no sense. The words he did not say. He thinks about General Sullivan's words. You see a bad plan, you speak. Arguing saves lives. Silence kills. It is the simplest equation in the world. And it took 34 dead men for him to learn it. The weeks that follow are a blur of training, briefings, and small engagements. Jensen is promoted. Not because he followed orders. Because he questioned them. Because he argued. Because he used the democratic habits that the army had tried to bury and turned them into a weapon. He trains replacement soldiers. Young men, 18 and 19 years old, fresh off the boats from America. They arrive expecting the same brutal hierarchy they experienced in basic training. Expecting to be told what to do and punished for asking why. Jensen gives them something different. He teaches them to read terrain, to question plans, to speak up when something does not make sense. He tells them about Kasserine, about the 42 men in his platoon, about the 8 who walked out, about the silence that killed the other 34. You see a bad plan, you speak, he tells them. I don't care if it's me standing here or a general. You say it. Because the man who stays silent when he knows better is not a good soldier. He's a coward. One of the replacements, Private Tommy Blake, 22 years old, truck driver from Indiana, raises his hand. Sergeant, he says, what if we're wrong? Jensen looks at him. Then you're wrong, he says. But at least you were thinking. At least you were trying. The Germans were fighting. They have 300 years of military tradition. They have the finest tactical training in the world. They have officers who can run circles around ours. But they have one weakness. One fatal flaw. He pauses. They can't argue. Their system doesn't allow it. A German private who sees something wrong stays silent because that's what his system demands. A German sergeant who knows a plan is bad executes it anyway because obedience is sacred. That's their weakness. And it's going to kill them. Blake nods slowly. So we argue, Jensen says. We question. We push back. Not because we're undisciplined. Because we're trying to get it right. And when we get it right, when we have a plan that actually makes sense, then we execute that plan with everything we have. He looks around at the replacements. Young faces, nervous eyes, men who have never been in combat. You came from a country where you argue with your boss, where you question authority, where you expect explanations. Jensen says, the army tried to train that out of you. I'm here to tell you to get it back. Because that's the weapon. That's what's going to win this war. One of them asks about equipment problems. Sergeant, what if the gear doesn't work the way they said it would? Jensen looks at him. Then you fix it. Or you find someone who can. We've got welders, mechanics, farm boys who can build anything with scrap metal. You use what you have. You improvise. He does not know it yet, but in 1 year, he will turn that philosophy into a 400-pound steel device that changes the war. The replacements look at each other. Some of them smile. Some of them nod. They do not yet understand what Jensen is building. They do not yet see that this collision between democratic habits and military necessity is forging something unprecedented. A fighting force that combines the discipline of a professional army with the initiative of free citizens. But they will. 9 months later, Jensen stands on a deck off Normandy. Everything he learned at Kasserine, argue, question, act, is about to collide with 300 years of Prussian obedience. The collision will decide the war. June 6, 1944, 6 o'clock in the morning. Somewhere in Germany, Adolf Hitler is asleep. He went to bed at 3 in the morning after a late-night conference. He sleeps in a darkened room, curtains drawn, guards outside the door with orders not to disturb him. In Normandy, France, American paratroopers have been on the ground for hours. The invasion is underway. Clearly, undeniably, the largest amphibious assault in human history is happening right now, at this moment, and the supreme commander of the German armed forces is asleep. General Erich Strauss, 52 years old, commander of the 84th Corps, is at a map exercise when the first reports come in. He is rehearsing defensive scenarios, moving wooden blocks across a table, when an aide bursts through the door. Sir, the invasion. It's happening. Strauss looks at the map. He has been preparing for this moment for months. He knows exactly what needs to happen. The Panzer Reserves, positioned specifically to counterattack any beachhead in its first vulnerable hours, need to move immediately. Now, this minute, he reaches for the telephone. He calls up the chain of command for authorization. The voice on the other end of the line is calm, procedural, following protocol. Wait for orders from above, General. The decision must come from the Führer. The Führer is asleep, Strauss says. Then we wait until he wakes. Strauss looks at the map. He can see it happening. The window closing. Every minute that passes, the Allies dig in deeper. Every hour of delay costs him the initiative. He knows this. Every general in the German command structure knows this. But no one will wake Hitler without authorization. And no one will release the panzers without Hitler's personal order. 300 years of Prussian obedience. An oath to a single man. A system that demands absolute compliance. The panzers sit still. By the time Hitler wakes, is briefed, and issues authorization, it is early afternoon. The critical window, the hours when a determined armored counterattack could have driven the Allies back into the sea, is gone. The commanders on the ground knew what was happening. Some of them were screaming into telephones, demanding authorization to move. But the system, the same system that produced perfect panzer execution in France in 1940, required the man at the top to give the order. And the man at the top was asleep. 6 o'clock in the morning, the same moment. Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen, 30 years old, 5'10", 158 pounds now, leaner than he was in North Africa, stands on the deck of a landing craft 3 miles off the coast of Normandy, Utah Beach. His company has been assigned to support the 4th Infantry Division. The radio is dead. Static and garbled voices. The plan, carefully rehearsed over weeks of training, is already falling apart. Landing craft are scattered. Units are mixing. Officers are trying to regroup men they have never met. Jensen's lieutenant, a 23-year-old from Ohio named Cooper, looks at the chaos and freezes. His hands are shaking. This is his first combat. Sergeant, Cooper says. What do we do? Jensen looks at the beach. He can see German positions on the high ground. He can see American soldiers pinned down behind beach obstacles. He can see the situation developing in real time. The plan called for them to land 200 yards to the north. But the current has pushed them south. The radio is dead. No one is telling them what to do. In a German unit, this moment would require authorization from above. A lieutenant would wait for orders. A sergeant would execute only what he was told. Jensen does not wait. We move forward, he says. Get the men off this boat and up that beach. Link up with whoever we find. Suppress those positions on the high ground. But the plan is dead, Jensen says. We're not waiting. Move. Cooper nods. His hands stop shaking. The landing craft hits the beach. The ramp drops. Jensen goes first. Thompson submachine gun up, legs driving through the water, eyes scanning for threats. Behind him, 40 men follow. No dusere. No orders from above. Just a staff sergeant from Tennessee who grew up arguing with customers and questioning distributors and refusing to accept what did not make sense. Acting on his own judgment because the situation demanded it and waiting was not an option. This is what Captain Werner Schmidt saw in that detention area in August. This is what he called a mob. A private arguing with a sergeant changing plans, an officer listening. But what Schmidt could not see, what the entire Prussian military tradition could not process, was that this apparent chaos was actually a different kind of order. An order built on trust, on competence earned rather than inherited, on the understanding that the man on the ground with the best information is the one who decides. Jensen's company moves inland. They link up with elements from 3 different units. They suppress German positions. They hold ground. And all across Normandy, in ditches and hedgerows and flooded fields, thousands of other American soldiers are doing the same thing, acting without orders, improvising, assessing and deciding and moving because that is what they have been trained to do. Not by a manual that says act without orders. By a culture that says you know the mission, you see the situation, you act. Late June, 1944. Normandy Bocage. The advance has slowed to a crawl. 1 mile per day. 300 tanks lost every week. The problem is the hedgerows. 4-foot earthen banks topped with 15 feet of vegetation. Root systems 12 feet deep, thick as a man's arm, interlocking like iron cables underground. Every field is surrounded by these ancient boundaries. Every advance requires crossing them. And every time a Sherman tank tries to climb a hedgerow, it exposes its belly armor. The thinnest armor on the vehicle. German anti-tank teams position themselves on the other side and wait. The tank climbs. The barrel points at the sky. The belly is exposed. 1 shot. The tank burns. Jensen sits in a field near St. Lo with a group of sergeants and junior officers. They are supposed to be planning the next day's advance. Instead, they are arguing about the hedgerows. Everyone has an idea. Most of them are terrible. Explosives to blow gaps. Infantry charges to clear the other side first. Artillery barrages to flatten the vegetation. Nothing works. The hedgerows are too thick. The Germans are too well positioned. The casualties are unsustainable. A private named Ezra Whitlock, 25 years old, Tennessee farm boy, speaks up. He is not supposed to be in this meeting. He wandered over from his squad position because he heard the argument and had a thought. In a German unit, a private does not insert himself into an officer's meeting. In a German unit, a private who did that would be disciplined. Jensen sees him standing at the edge of the group. Whitlock, Jensen says. You got something? Whitlock hesitates. Then he points at a Sherman tank parked 30 yards away. What if we put teeth on the front, he says. Like a saw. Cut through the hedgerow instead of climbing over it. Most of the group laughs. A saw on the front of a tank. It sounds ridiculous. Jensen does not laugh. He walks over to the Sherman. He looks at the front armor. He thinks about the hedgerows. About the root systems. About the problem they are trying to solve. Show me what you mean, he says. Whitlock walks over. He uses his hands to describe it. Steel prongs, angled down, driven into the base of the hedgerow. The tank pushes forward, the prongs cut through the roots, the whole thing comes apart from below instead of being climbed from above. Jensen looks around the field. There are German beach obstacles scattered everywhere. Hedgehogs, the X-shaped anti-invasion barriers that the Germans placed on the beaches to stop landing craft. Steel beams welded together. Heavy, strong. He points at one. We used those, he says. Over the next 3 days, Jensen and Whitlock and a corporal named Harris, who used to work in a machine shop in Detroit, fabricate a prototype. They cut the hedgehog apart. 12 steel prongs, 18 inches long, angled 30 degrees down. 400 pounds of steel welded to the front of a Sherman tank. On July 14th, Lieutenant General Omar Bradley watches a demonstration. The Sherman accelerates toward a hedgerow. The prongs hit the earthen bank. The tank does not climb. It drives forward. The prongs cut through the roots like a plow through soil. The hedgerow splits. The tank drives through. Not over it. Through it. Bradley watches in silence. Then he turns to his aide. How many of these can we make? 11 days later, 500 Rhino devices have been manufactured and installed. 3 out of every 5 tanks in 1st Army carry the modification. The device that Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen and Private Ezra Whitlock designed in a field near St. Lo with no engineering background and no authorization from above. The Germans have brilliant engineers, skilled welders, innovative minds, but their system has no pathway for a private's idea to reach a general's desk in 3 days. A sergeant with a welding torch does not present solutions to generals in the Wehrmacht. He waits for directives from above. And directives, if they come at all, come in weeks or months, not days. The Rhino device enables Operation Cobra. Cobra breaks the German army in the West. And the man who designed it receives the Legion of Merit and goes back to his unit and continues fighting. October 1944. Hurtgen Forest. The trees here are tall and dark. Pine and fir packed so tightly that sunlight barely reaches the ground. The Germans have mined every trail, every clearing, every approach. The forest swallows men whole. Jensen's tank hits a mine on a dirt road 3 miles inside the tree line. The explosion lifts the front of the Sherman 2 feet off the ground. The crew inside survives. Jensen, standing in the commander's hatch, does not. The blast catches his left leg. Below the knee, the tibia shatters. The fibula breaks in 3 places. Shrapnel severs the major artery. He wakes up 4 hours later in a field hospital. A surgeon, a major named Kellerman, is standing over him. We had to take the leg, Kellerman says. Below the knee.
I'm sorry.
Jensen looks down. His left leg ends in bandages and emptiness. The surgery took 4 hours. 8 pints of blood. He weighs 142 pounds now, 23 pounds lighter than when he enlisted in 1941. His face is gaunt. His hair is mostly gray. He is 30 years old. The war for him is over. November 1945. Occupied Germany. A former Wehrmacht general sits across a table from an American colonel. The general is 60 years old. He fought in France on the Eastern Front in the West. He commanded formations that, man for man and unit for unit, were among the finest combat organizations in history. The colonel asks him a question. What did the German High Command think of American soldiers? Not American machines. Not American air power. American soldiers. The men. The general is quiet for a moment. Then he says something he would never have said in 1943. Enthusiastic amateurs with a disposition to aggression I had never seen in any other nation's sons. He pauses. What surprised me most was how they reacted to being attacked. Every other Allied force would return fire and edge toward a better position. Americans would return fire, bring down their entire weight of fire support, and then counterattack the moment the fire lifted. No pause to consult higher command. No waiting for authorization. Just fire. Call for support. Push forward. The colonel writes this down. That is not the response of an army built on obedience, the general says. That is the response of an army built on initiative. Knoxville, Tennessee. 1945. Robert Jensen returns home in November. He walks off the train on a prosthetic leg, a duffel bag over his shoulder, wearing his uniform with the ribbons on his chest. Purple Heart, Legion of Merit, Bronze Star. His family is waiting. His sister runs to him. His mother cries. His father shakes his hand and does not let go for a long time. He goes back to selling whiskey, the same job he had before the war, the same customers, the same arguments about prices and quality and value. He never writes a memoir. He rarely speaks about the war. When people ask him what he did, he tells them he was a tank sergeant. He does not mention Kasserine. He does not mention El Getter. He does not mention the Rhino device. But the Rhino device still exists. In 1946, the original prototype is donated to the Smithsonian Institution. National Museum of American History, Tank Section 4B. A 12-pronged steel plow welded to a piece of Sherman armor. 400 pounds of steel that changed the war. The placard next to it reads, Rhino device, designed by Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen and Private Ezra Whitlock, 1944. June, 1990. Jensen's grandson, a man named Michael, 28 years old, gives an interview to a local Tennessee newspaper. The reporter asks him about his grandfather, who is 76 now, living in a nursing home, his mind still sharp but his body failing. What did he teach you about the war? The reporter asks. Michael thinks about it. He said the best soldiers were the ones who argued, Michael says. Not the ones who blindly followed orders. The ones who questioned, who pushed back, who used their minds. The reporter writes this down. He said that's what won the war, Michael continues. Not the tanks or the planes or the factories. The fact that an American private could tell a sergeant he was wrong and the sergeant would listen. That's what beat the Germans. They had better training, better tactics, better tradition, but they couldn't argue. And that killed them. May 12, 1991. Robert Jensen dies in his sleep. He is 77 years old. The nursing home calls his family. His children and grandchildren gather. The funeral is scheduled for 3 days later. 8 men attend. All of them World War II veterans. All of them over 70. One of them is Tommy Blake, the same private who argued with Jensen over a map in August 1944 while a German captain watched and called them a mob. The truck driver from Indiana who learned that arguing saves lives. Blake carries something in his coat pocket. A piece of rusted steel, 6 inches long. One of the prongs from the original Rhino prototype. He found it in a field in France in 1987 during a veterans tour. He brought it home. He kept it for 4 years. At the funeral, after the service, Blake places the steel prong on Jensen's coffin. For the sergeant who listened, he says. France, August 1944. One more time. Captain Werner Schmidt sits in the detention area, watching Staff Sergeant Robert Jensen argue with Private Tommy Blake about a map. Blake is pointing. Jensen is listening. The plan is changing. Schmidt whispers to the soldier beside him, They are a mob. He is watching 300 years of Prussian military discipline confronting 168 years of American democracy made military. He is watching the collision between obedience and initiative, between silence and argument, between the cage and the weapon. He is watching the thing that will defeat him, and he has no framework for recognizing it. Schmidt sits in that detention area for 3 more weeks before being transferred to a POW camp in England. He thinks about what he saw every day. Years later, after the war, he will tell his son, I called them undisciplined. I was wrong. They had a different discipline, one that required thinking, not just obeying. And that discipline defeated us. Because the strongest systems are not the ones that silence questions. They are the ones that answer them. The mob won.